What if the story you were taught about America's founding leaves out most of the people who actually lived it? Before there was a United States, this continent was home to hundreds of nations, cities, and trade networks that had existed for thousands of years. The real story of America isn't a straight line from a discovery to a superpower. Actually, it's a story of collision between old worlds and new ambitions, between freedom for some and bondage for others. To understand how the United States became the most powerful nation on earth, we have to start long before 1776 with the people who were here first. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, North America held millions of people, organized into hundreds of distinct nations, each with its own language and government. In the Northeast, the Haudenosaunee bound together 5, later 6, nations under a political system some historians believe influenced the framers of the U.S. Constitution. In the Southwest, Pueblo and peoples built multi-story stone and adobe cities that had stood for centuries. In the Mississippi River Valley, the city of Cahokia once housed a population rivaling medieval London, complete with massive earthen pyramids and a continent-spanning trade network. Honestly, these were not simple or static societies. They farmed, traded, waged war, formed alliances, and developed sophisticated agriculture, including the cultivation of corn, a feat modern geneticists study. This was the world European colonizers encountered, not an empty wilderness, but a continent full of history. When Spanish, French, English, and Dutch ships began arriving in the late 15th and 16th centuries, they found a land they were determined to take. Spanish expeditions pushed into the southeast and southwest, aiming for conquest and conversion. French traders and missionaries moved through the Great Lakes and Mississippi corridor, often building alliances with native nations for the fur trade. Seriously, English colonists landed on the Atlantic coast, frequently arriving desperate and dependent on native knowledge and food just to survive their first winters. But contact brought something far more devastating than any army: disease. Smallpox, measles, and other illnesses to which native populations had no immunity swept through the continent, often racing ahead of the colonizers and wiping out communities that had never even seen a European. Most historians agree that epidemic disease was the single largest cause of native population decline in the century after contact. Where disease didn't destroy native communities, colonial violence did. Wars like the Pequot War in New England set a brutal template, blurring the line between combatant and civilian and burning villages. Colonial governments and native nations signed hundreds of treaties, but these agreements were broken again and again as colonial appetite for land grew. Still, native nations were never passive victims in this story. They resisted, adapted, and fought back. Anyway, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 successfully drove Spanish colonizers out of present-day New Mexico for over a decade, one of the most successful indigenous uprisings in American history. Nations formed and reformed alliances, played rival European powers against each other, and fought to protect their homelands for centuries. By the mid-1700s, 13 British colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast, increasingly resentful of taxes imposed from London. In 1775, armed conflict broke out, and in 1776 colonial leaders declared independence, founding a nation on the idea that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. It was a revolutionary idea, and it came bundled with a glaring contradiction. Now, the document proclaiming these universal rights was written by a man who enslaved over 600 people in his lifetime. At the moment of the nation's founding, roughly 1 in 5 people living in the 13 colonies was enslaved. The Constitution ratified in 1788 didn't abolish slavery, it enshrined it, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for political representation. Native nations, meanwhile, were caught in the middle of a war they hadn't started. Most who took sides allied with the British, hoping a British victory would slow colonial expansion onto their land. Actually, when Britain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783, native nations weren't even consulted. Their territory was simply handed over on paper. So from its first breath, the new nation held two ideas in tension: a founding promise of liberty and a founding practice of dispossession and bondage. That tension didn't resolve at independence, it would define the next century. As the young United States grew, it didn't just expand, it consumed. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubled the nation's size overnight, bought from France for land that was home to dozens of native nations. Land acquisition became the engine of American growth, and the ideology that justified it needed a name: Manifest Destiny, the belief the United States was fated to expand across the continent. Honestly, that belief had brutal legal machinery behind it. In 1823, the Supreme Court's decision in Johnson v. McIntosh established the doctrine of discovery, a legal principle holding the United States held ultimate title to native lands by having discovered them first. It's a doctrine still cited in American law today. Then came Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830, which authorized the forced relocation of tens of thousands of native people from their homelands in the southeast to territory west of the Mississippi. The Cherokee Nation's forced march west, remembered as the Trail of Tears, killed thousands of people through exposure, starvation, and disease along the way. Seriously, one U.S. Army general, writing about the Seminole people who resisted removal in Florida, put the policy's underlying logic in chillingly plain terms. The only way to be rid of them was extermination. This wasn't the fringe sentiment, it was federal policy, executed by the federal government for decades. Meanwhile, the institution of slavery was expanding right alongside the nation's borders. Cotton, picked by enslaved labor, became the country's most valuable export and the engine of a booming, deeply profitable Southern economy, an economy built on the ownership of human beings. Anyway, by 1860, nearly 4 million people were enslaved in the United States. The nation's rapid growth in wealth and territory in this era cannot be separated from the twin engines that powered it: the removal of native nations from their land and the forced labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants. Those contradictions finally came to a head in 1861. 11 southern states seceded rather than accept restrictions on slavery's expansion, and the Civil War, the deadliest conflict in American history, killed an estimated 750,000 people. It ended with the Union preserved and, through the 13th Amendment, slavery formally abolished. But abolition on paper didn't mean equality in practice. Now, the brief period of Reconstruction gave way within about a decade to a system of legal segregation and disenfranchisement across the South, what became known as Jim Crow, enforced through law, economic coercion, and often outright terror. It would take another century of organizing, legal battles, and civil rights activism before the country began seriously dismantling that system. The devastation of the Civil War freed up federal military resources, and the government turned them west. In the decades after the war, U.S. Army campaigns against Plains nations intensified, breaking treaty after treaty as railroads, homesteaders, and gold prospectors pushed on to native land. Actually, the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie recognized the Black Hills as the permanent territory of the Sioux Nation, until gold was discovered there, and the treaty was violated within a decade. Treaty-making with native nations formally ended in 1871, replaced by a policy of forced assimilation, reservations, boarding schools designed to erase native languages and cultures, and land allotment policies that stripped away millions more acres of tribal land. Out of this violent expansion, the United States built something new, an industrial colossus. The same railroads that had helped displace Plains nations stitched together a continental market. Waves of immigrants from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Eastern Europe, and China poured into American factories, mines, and cities, powering an economic transformation almost without precedent. Honestly, by 1900, the United States had become the world's largest industrial economy, producing more steel, more oil, and more manufactured goods than any other nation on Earth. This growth came with real costs, dangerous working conditions, child labor, and vast inequality between industrial titans and the workers who built their fortunes. Two world wars in the 20th century then repositioned America on the global stage entirely. World War I left European economies devastated while America's homeland remained untouched by combat, emerging as a creditor to the world. Seriously, World War II went further still. While European and Asian industrial centers were bombed into rubble, American factories ran at full capacity. The U.S. emerged in 1945 as the only major power with its infrastructure fully intact, its economy dominant, and, for a brief period, sole possession of nuclear weapons. The post-war decades cemented what the war had made possible. The US dollar became the world's reserve currency, and American culture, technology, and military power extended around the globe. Anyway, it was in this era that the civil rights movement finally forced the country to confront its unfinished business from the Civil War, winning landmark legal victories against segregation and disenfranchisement. It was a reminder that the nation's founding contradictions weren't ancient history, but a struggle playing out within living memory. Native nations, too, entered a new chapter. Beginning in the mid-20th century, a resurgence of indigenous political organizing, from the occupation of Alcatraz in 1969 to the standoff at Wounded Knee in 1973, pushed the federal government toward a policy of tribal self-determination rather than assimilation. Now, there are now more than 570 federally recognized tribal nations in the United States, each holding a distinct legal and political relationship with the federal government. By the century's end, the United States stood as the world's largest economy and most powerful military, at the center of global trade, finance, and technological innovation, a position it holds today. Here's the thing that's easy to miss if you only tell the triumphant version of this story. American power wasn't built despite this history, it was built through it. The land base that made a continental economy possible came from native nations, dispossessed through treaty violation and forced removal. The wealth that jump-started the American economy came from enslaved labor. Actually, the country's rise to global dominance in the 20th century was accelerated by the devastation of its rivals in wars that spared the American homeland almost entirely. None of this erases the genuine achievements, the innovation, the resilience, the expansion of rights that, however slowly, did eventually reach more people. But a true history has to hold both things at once, a nation that built extraordinary power and a nation whose ascent was paid for by people who never consented to the price. Today, the descendants of that history are here, still telling their own stories. Native nations continue to fight in court and in Congress for treaty rights, land, and sovereignty. The economic and social aftershocks of slavery and segregation remain active subjects of American political life. Honestly, the United States remains a work in progress, a country that likes to describe itself as a grand experiment because, in a real sense, it still is one. Understanding how America became powerful, not the sanitized version, but the real one, doesn't make the country's story less remarkable. If anything, it makes it more complicated, more human, and more honest. That is the true story of America.